Hey everyone, it's so good to be together tonight, no matter where you're joining us from. We recognize some of the names in the on the list here, and I'm sure there's folks who are watching on Facebook Live as well. We thought we would maybe open it up a little bit to introduce ourselves first, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of sharing, and then we'll have some time at the end to open it up for question and responses. So we want to encourage any of you, if you have a question that arises while we're talking and you want to make sure you don't forget it, feel free to just drop it in the comments and we'll try to get to it toward the end of our time together. Let me just introduce myself. My name is Gail Bantum, and this is Brian Bantum. And we've been married 25 and a half years. It'll be 26 this August. And it's been a ride. We got married when we were 10, so you do the math. Yeah, we're joining y'all from Seattle, Washington, where the sun shines 3 months out of the year, and today is not one of those days. But we're excited to be with you. We also wanted to share a little bit of what we do. I am a lead pastor here at a local church called Quest Church. I've been in this role for nearly 3 years now, which is incredible to imagine. 2 of those years being through a pandemic. I was the executive pastor for 10 years prior to that of the same church. And so I'm in a season where I'm thriving. I'm loving what I do, even in the midst of the challenges. So yeah, I'm grateful to be here, to be joined with my partner, Brian. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so Brian Bantum. I am a professor of theology. I have a fancy name. I forgot the name. Neil F. Oh, that's right. I almost forgot the name of my own job. So I'm the Neil F. and Illa A. Professor of Theology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. And we've been married 25, almost 26 years this year. We've been in Seattle for 13 years now, but kind of been all over. So we're married and lived on the East Coast, and then down to Durham for a while, then across the country here to Seattle. We've got 3 beautiful grown boys who all live with us. So we're all householding together. And for some reason, we decided to add a puppy to it all in the midst of a pandemic. And we both love it and ask ourselves why over and over and over again. And funny enough, the puppy has brought up all of the old marriage things again and again and again. So
because our youngest is 17, almost 18, so we were almost free.
Almost. And then the pandemic hit, and here we are.
Well, we wanted to maybe start off by addressing a question that we get a lot, especially in the last couple weeks. And that question is, why a marriage book, and how has it been kind of launching and promoting a marriage book in this moment? And even today, this morning, I'm a pastor, so I had a meeting this morning with one of my church members, and he asked me, he's like, how's it going launching this book? Are you excited? And at every turn, my answer is labored. And I'm not quite sure why, but I wanted to share my attempt at why I think it's a little bit labored. While we're excited about the book that we co-wrote, and much of it really sharing our story, some of our hard times, just being real on what we experience in our marriage. And I keep coming back to the fact that when our book launched on March 1, it was right around the time when everything was going down with Ukraine. There was all kinds of things happening in our world. And then even ahead of this particular webinar, I'm trying to promote it as best I can. And this is the week where we had tremendous reminders of anti-Asian hate. And as an Asian American woman, navigating those realities. I'm also a pastor of a multi-church, a multicultural, multi-ethnic, intergenerational church. And so addressing all of these things that are happening in our world, caring for our people in the midst of these spaces, as well as pastoring people, not only in our church, but my colleagues, my friends who have experienced tremendous challenges in their own marriages and even some divorces during this pandemic over the past 2 years. You know, any crags that any of us have had pre-pandemic, the pandemic has really exposed and laid bare for a lot of us, some of those spaces and those hardships. So that's real. And I say all this because in the midst of the excitement and the joy of sharing our book with the world, the reality is that there's so many things in our lives that we bring into our relationship, the reality of who we are in our particularities as an Asian American woman, as a pastor, as a biracial, as a Black man, right? That marriage itself is not the epitome of our identity, that we are navigating the multiplicity of realities in our world, that we're all trying to navigate and experience together as we bring into this, as we bring it into our marriage as well.
Yeah, and I think that one of the reasons why we hoped to offer this book to the world was that I think in reality, our relationship has always been never just about the two of us. It's never, you know, on the one hand, you kind of get away from the kind of rom-com Disney-fied notions of love that's always getting easier and easier and easier over time. And that's one way of thinking about it, one challenge that we have to kind of overcome in ideas of thinking about marriage. But then there's also these ideas about marriage of a kind of sealed off relationship. Gail and I were big fans of like all of the married reality shows. So Married at First Sight, Love is Blind. I mean, we are here for the drama, more drama, the better. But one of the things about those shows that is so deceptive is that these people are kind of getting to know one another in this kind of sealed universe. Like it was really interesting when the pandemic happened, and the only way that you knew the pandemic happened was because you would see crew wearing masks sometimes. But apart from that, like you didn't know if any, you could watch a season at any moment and not know what else was happening. You wouldn't know about the police violence. You wouldn't know about kind of trauma of economic inequity. You wouldn't know about like gender violence. It's just all of a sudden these two people, as though nothing else existed. And the reality though is like for marriage, we bring all of that stuff with us. We exist in a world and we're connected to kind of cultural realities. We're connected to current events. We're connected to histories of gender and race and sexuality. And we bring all of that luggage, all of those pieces into this life together. And a marriage is really a kind of the creation of a new culture, but it's not something brand new. It's not something that's made like out of nothing. It's made from all of these pieces of a life that we used to lead. And it's made out of all of these histories that have shaped us and formed us in some real ways. And so one of the reasons why we wanted to write this book in the way that we did is it was just so hard to we walked through with so many couples that we're trying to navigate life together, but without any kind of resources to think about these broader histories and how they shape our everyday life and how they shape how it is that we live together. And so one of the biggest things, like as Gail and I have kind of grown in our life together, that I'm really mindful of is especially, and we talk about race and ethnicity, and we talk about a lot of those real life things. But one of the really big things that I had to learn, and I think that we had to navigate together, were this long histories of gender.
Yeah.
And these realities that shaped both like who Gail was as a woman and who I am as a man. And granted, like marriage looks a lot of different ways. And so in our case, it is, marriage between a man and a woman, and the realities of same gender loving relationships will look a little bit different, but we also think there's going to be some overlaps because everyone has to navigate those histories together. But when we were writing this book together and I was reading Gail's account of glass bulbs and rubber balls, and it reminded me of all of those ways I had to learn about how gender shaped Gail and what that meant for our life together, all the challenges that she had to go through as a woman, and what that meant for us moving, kind of what it meant for us to be one and whole along the way. So I don't know. So what were some of the ways that you felt like you were both shaped in terms of being a woman, and then what that meant once we got married?
Yeah, in a recent podcast that we did, the host actually a couple hosts named a subheading that I have in there: does gender norms always win? And he mentioned where I noted that at a certain point I had to become really callous, in the sense that there was a point where Brian was getting all kinds of opportunities, and I was really thriving here in Seattle in that season of life. Our kids were growing, and I had to put my foot down and said, no, I'm the glass bulb right now. I'm the one that we said we are going to kind of help nurture my role, my call in this season. And I had to put my foot down, and it almost sounded like ungracious in many ways. But I realized often as a woman, this society and the structures of our world do not bend toward us or in our favor, right? That this is the air we breathe. And a lot of times we're constantly searching for and scrapping for a little bit of air for ourselves where we can thrive, where we have space to flourish, where we're not necessarily having to take a back seat to somebody else's flourishing. And we're not always the help and the support. And so there was several seasons in our marriage, but this one in particular, more recently, where I had to say, listen, no, I'm thriving and I'm going to need you to work it out. And if I'm not thriving, we're not thriving. And I'm wondering if that's actually significant for many of our relationships, right? I remember there was another time when my kids were young and we decided to go do the bottle feed because it would allow him to help in the parenting in the night shifts. If I do not sleep, I am no good to anybody. And so I know myself. You have to know yourself. And I realized I'm going to need help in this area because I was also working. And so having to navigate, what does it look like for each of us to thrive? And sometimes it looks like, at least for us, where I knew that if I let this slide, it was going to look like the man is always taking the lead. The man's job is always taking the primary space in the context of our family. And I had to fight for it. And, sometimes that's necessary and that's a good thing. And thankfully, Brian was in a space where he can hear that. He understood, checked it, and we were able to kind of stay and create space for both of us to thrive. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think in some ways we kind of talk about these really big issues, like we think about all of the isms, whether it's sexism or racism, and it feels very abstract. But in actuality, it's all really every day. It works itself out in these kind of tiny little moments. And with so many married couples that we've walked with, and it's been our experience being married, is that, you have like these really big ideas, these big histories, these big kind of pressures. But oftentimes they work themselves out in really small moments, like who's going to cook dinner, who's going to take care of the baby, who's gonna feed, who's thinking about all of the lists. And so that was really almost always the ground. And that's where so often where the tension comes, because the reason why someone doesn't feel like they can take an opportunity is not necessarily because there's a big sign on the door that says, no women allowed. What I had to learn from Gail in her experience is so often that she was saying no because she was like, well, I got to figure out how the kids are going to get to school. I got to figure out how to make these dinners. Brian's really loving this right now. So I'm just going to say no, because maybe it's not my time. And you keep doing that over and over and over again. Next thing you know, it's a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And so this is where gender works itself out. But then on the flip side of it, what I also began to realize was that it was also limiting me. We talk a little bit in the book about how I was on this kind of trajectory to, the next best job, always looking for the next thing, and the ways that my identity was so wrapped up in my job. And I think for men, so many of us, that's really true, that like our worth, our value, our sense of power and freedom is wrapped up in, oh, I have this job and I'm going to get this promotion. And the whole world is kind of oriented towards helping me to experience that kind of freedom. But all of a sudden, when we begin to slow down a little bit, and we have these kind of really hard conversations about grocery shopping, about who's going to be home for the kids, then all of a sudden it's not easy enough. It's not easy for me to kind of just carve out a whole week so I can work on this paper or this presentation. All of a sudden I have to think about grocery lists and what we're going to do for dinner, and kind of carting people back and forth. And all of a sudden my life has to slow down a little bit. And I bucked against it. I fought against it because I saw my friends and these other people that I respected, it felt like they were moving so fast. But when I took a step back, that time allowed me to also say, well, wait a second, is that what I really want? And being able to take time to figure out, oh, wait a second, like helping out with cooking, and all of a sudden realizing that I really loved to cook. I really love being able to kind of play with a dog in certain moments. But then even then, there's going to be some things where I don't like to do it. Gail doesn't like to do it, but it's still got to get done, right?
Uber Eats.
or Uber Eats or McDonald's. So part of the life together in navigating these really big ideas like gender is also beginning to figure out how is it that we can begin to name those things and the patterns that are working in our life, and really kind of like limiting each of us, but maybe in different ways. They don't always have to be the same way, but they're limiting us in different ways. So what does it mean for us to begin to make space for one another, to either for one of us to slow down, for another one to claim space for themselves, and that's one of the deepest challenges of thinking about marriage and the life together is how can we trust one another to make space for the other, and be honest with one another when things are feeling too constricted, too limited, whether it's because of life together or these other bigger realities that we're facing all the time.
And I will say, just in general, chapter 4, if you haven't read the book, I want to encourage you to make sure you don't skip over chapter 4. Chapter 4 is my favorite chapter. All the chapters are great. Chapter 4 is the chapter that Brian wrote on masculinity. Game changer. We're anticipating his inbox to blow up from men saying they no longer like him anymore because of what it's done to empower their partners in life. But I'm wondering, in there, one of the most beautiful analogies that Brian gives is this analogy of the pocket. I'm wondering if maybe you can kind of share just a little bit about because I didn't know that until he preached it at our church once, but wondering if you could just share a little bit about that, just so we all can take away a little bit of an imagery or like even historical fact here.
Oh, thanks, Pam. I'm glad you like that chapter.
It's my favorite.
So part of this idea of thinking about of how do we create space for one another? I mean, one of the things that we have to do is we have to recognize dynamics of power, that those dynamics of power are always working. Mm-hmm. And that one of those dynamics of power that really functions for men is that we actually have a pretty, people let us get away with a lot of stuff. I'll put it that way.
Yes.
So for example, like I do laundry, I cook, I take care of the kids, maybe not well, but the fact that I do any of that stuff means that I am freaking amazing.
Heroic.
Right. Yeah. The perfect man, even in some ways. And so what is it that creates that is that there's this idea that, men actually don't need to do those things, that they're formed in such a way. And so, so then you think about all these different ways that, little things for men are kind of overlooked. Oh, he's just a guy. Of course, he's going to forget about this. Oh, like he's a guy. So of course he'll, he's going to have a wandering eye. Oh, he's a guy. So of course he's going to want to play and have his own time in his man cave and all that kind of stuff. Right. And so all of those are like dynamics of power. The dynamics of power that are slowly woven into a kind of relationship that gives us as men like all kinds of leeway, right? And if we do the slightest thing well, like we're freaking amazing, right? And whereas a woman has to like oftentimes do everything perfect and everything has to be done exactly the right way, but not so much, because otherwise they come off as domineering, as they come off as kind of controlling or nagging or whatever. So we're kind of good, right? So we have a kind of power in some ways. And there's this really interesting research and story of pockets, of how pockets came to be. And Gail and I were walking one day, and she asked me to put something in my pocket. She's like, "Oh, can you put this my phone in your pocket?" And I was like, "Well, don't you have pockets? Because clearly, I see pockets on the butt. There's pockets on the side. You should be fine." She's like, "Oh, well, those aren't real pockets." I was like, "What do you mean? What do you mean they're not real pockets?" And so they're just there. They're just for decoration. Yeah. And so if you do some history on the pockets, the reason why there are no pockets in women's clothing is because of this.
Or very shallow,
is that there's this kind of patriarchal notion that women don't need them. They don't need them because they don't need their own money. The man's going to pay. The man has the money. And then if the man has the money, the man also has the control. Oh, I'll give you some allowance, baby. You can get yourself some lipstick. Take care of yourself. Right? So over and over and over again, all of a sudden the man has the pockets because the man holds the means of his own self-determination, the determination of his wife, the determination of his children around him. And so he has all of these pockets, this kind of privilege of freedom. And of course, it's a freedom that is not necessarily free, because it also comes with all of these expectations of masculinity and certainty and work that you cannot do and clothes that you cannot wear and respectability and all of this kind of stuff. But we think it makes us free. And so the question then becomes, well, how is it that we begin to use that freedom? Like, what does it mean to subvert the patriarchy in a different kind of way? And so one of the things that we can begin to do is we can begin to realize that because we have so much leeway, we actually don't have to do as much to get to be respected, frankly. We don't have to do as much to get the promotion. We don't need to do as much in order to do something. So I could say like, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I need to stay home with the kids today." And people were like, "Oh my gosh, you're such a good dad." And so I can say that, Whereas if Gail were to say like, no, I can't do that because you need to stay home with the kids, they'd be like, well, we need to have a hard conversation about your priorities and about whether or not you as a woman can really take on more responsibility. So sometimes what we can do is we can take that privilege as a man and begin to redistribute the benefits of it to our partner. So it means that I can afford to slow down a little bit because frankly, there's lots of work that I can do not as well and still be seen as being amazing,
and still
get promoted, still get asked to do things. And so in a way, it's kind of redistributing the wealth, redistributing the privilege so that it doesn't just serve me, but it can actually serve us, serve our family, create a kind of mutual flourishing. But then what it also does is in that slowing down, it might also open up my eyes to ask whether or not I need to do those things, whether or not there are actually joys of changing diapers and raising children and being there with those kind of tiny little moments, or taking care of an elderly parent, or taking care of a friend, taking food over to and just helping people to see that they're taken care of, which so often for men, right, those are not parts of our everyday life. Those are not expectations that we're kind of slowly drawn into. And is it possible that we actually become more compassionate, more complete, more human, actually, when we actually live more deeply into those contingencies? And it all begins and marriage is one place where that kind of formation is possible. It's not the only place, but maybe it's one place for us to begin to do that.
Yeah, and as we kind of both name the challenges of marriage, the hard spaces, the realities, right? This is real talk. And anyone who tells you otherwise is just lying to you. But in that, I love the way that we're always talking about this notion of mutual flourishing, to be able to trust, centered in trust in one another, being for the other, that whenever we are met by these hard and challenging moments, even if we have to put our foot down at some points, that there's always this underlying sense of, but I trust that the other person has my best interest in mind. We may not live it out or embody it perfectly, but at the core, at the heart of who we are together, there's trust. And I would say maybe as we kind of wrap our kind of segment, talking about why we still believe marriage is important in the midst of marriage not necessarily being the pinnacle, the only relationship that we believe that exists. It's not the epitome of human flourishing. But it's just one of many different relationships that a community needs: friendships, family, colleagues, church community, a wider community. But we are adamant that marriage is still a significant relationship in the life of a community. And one of the reasons why we dedicated this book to a group of 10 individuals. Few of them were married, few were just kind of dating, and then a few were single. And it was not a group that we had in our home because of relationships or because they were coupled, but it's a group that we earnestly had relationship with through our church as pastors, as a theologian, and that we gathered them for a year, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, in our home every week. We purposely cooked for them. They were all younger than us. We were a few steps ahead of them in life, in this journey of faith. And we called this group the Regroup. They were all leaders in our church, faithfully serving, but we noticed that they were in a season, every single one of them were in a season of trying to navigate faith, calling, vocation, relationships, just all of it. And we cooked for them a home cooked meal every week. We gathered with them ask questions, had them ask us questions. And it was a really formative time for us. And I think in that moment, even as they played with our kids, our home was their home. Over the years, we've had a chance to marry a few of them. Some of them, the single folks, got coupled with others. Some of them now have kids. And it's just been a beautiful journey to walk alongside them. And I think it reminded us that our marriage is never just for ourselves, right? And this is how we kind of started our time together, is that who we are is never just for our own flourishing. We strive for each other's flourishing, but as a married couple, it's never just for us. But what are we to the wider community? What can we offer? What container or a basket can we build? Can we weave together? What relationships in our lives help weave a stronger basket for the wider community to flourish? And when I look at each one of those names on that inside page that we dedicated this book to, we had a chance to meet with each one of them and to bless them and to thank them for helping our marriage. Even as we thought we were helping them and mentoring them, they really helped our marriage and our friendship, our family. So it was a mutual give and take that we are so grateful for. And so with that, I'm grateful for this space that we as a married couple can find ourselves writing a book on marriage, which we never thought we were going to do. And yet here we are in a space of people we both know and don't know. I'm sure there's people also on Facebook that, that will watch this in the days to come as well. But we wanted to open up a space for this community as well. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, nothing is off the table.
Nothing?
I think. It just depends on, no, usually, I mean, we're pretty cool. We're pretty honest and open. Mm-hmm. And so it's up to you. Do you want to know the answer? I guess is the real thing. We're going to just give us a few seconds here as we navigate these questions.
Yeah, so we have one question already. So how have you expressed this and or taught this to your children, thus subverting the understanding of masculinity and gender roles or privileges?
Do you have to press answer live?
I think so. We would like to answer the question live right now.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. So I think the one thing to name is that this idea of teaching your children about these things, again, doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like the formation of children, you can't just keep them sealed off in your house, teach them the right things, and then send them off, and they're going to be fully formed people who are like feminists or like non-racist or anything. Like they live in a world where they're getting messages and formations and stuff all of the time. And so when we raise our kids, you don't raise your kids to be finished. You hopefully raise your children with sensibilities and intuitions that they begin to learn how to own themselves in those kinds of ways. So I think that that's really important to say off the top of the bat. And part of the reason why I say that is that one of the things that we've tried to do is from a really young age is there are certain things that they have to do around the house. So they've been doing laundry since they were 10 years old, and that's just assumed. No one does laundry for them.
I'm not doing it.
Now, whether or not they fold their clothes or not is another issue, but they do their laundry. Sometimes they fold it, sometimes they don't, but that's their issue.
We never said we were perfect though. You know what I mean?
Right.
But we also don't do their laundry. So whatever it looks like down there, we don't know.
But it does mean that they have to track their own stuff, and they're responsible for the consequences. So if I see my kid, wearing sports shorts under his jeans, I realize he realizes he probably needed to do his laundry a day earlier, than he did. And so there's something about that kind of listening and hearing and planning that I think it slowly gets adapts. They learn how to do a little bit of their own cooking from really young ages to greater or lesser. So for one of the kids, he loves using the microwave, and that's what he does, but he feeds himself.
I will also say though, and those are just more like, I feel like stereotypical gendered roles, but I'll say one of the things that I've noticed that we've actually had to catch them in is just even in conversation around the dinner table, we'll be talking about something. And this gender stuff is insidious. I mean, they can have a father like Brian, and yet, right? So we're talking about something that I may not be great at knowing all the details about, but I'll offer my thoughts. But the reality is they'll always look to Brian for the right answer. And I remember catching one of them, like I looked at him straight in the eyes, like, why, when I gave you an answer, why do you then look to dad for the right answer? And it's little things like that, well, of course, dad would have the right answer. And it's those constant correcting, pointing out, if we can't do that here, we don't want that. I mean, we don't want that to bleed in other spaces. When you start working in your jobs and you're at a staff meeting and you have a woman leader, you better be giving her respect. That kind of stuff. And some of that is real subtle, but it has to be addressed. And it doesn't, even though they come from this house and this kind of formation, it's amazing how our formation is not only happening, people's formation doesn't just happen in the house, but outside of this space as well, that they pick things up from.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that we've noticed that's a real challenge is that, again, kind of coming back to this idea of a kind of freedom that, they can kind of do what they want and whenever they want to do it. Whereas thinking about the kind of realities that Gail faces, where, as soon as she steps out the door, she has to think about what she's wearing, what it looks like, whether or not it's going to elicit comments or not. When she walks into a room, there's this kind of expectation that she'll greet people and like be friendly. Whereas our boys, they've never had that kind of constant pressure necessarily. And so it forms them a little bit. And so kind of helping them to see that there are ways that you're still connected to all of these people, that kind of resisting that idea that just because you're a man doesn't mean you get to do kind of whatever you want and be kind of disconnected from people, that people are important, that relationship is important, that you need to be mindful of yourself and mindful of others. And those are things that we think they're still learning. But we feel like they've also recognized, I would say the other thing though too, is just by simply, because our household is kind of arranged in a slightly different way, I'm around a lot. And I think because I'm around a lot, sometimes to their chagrin, they're like, Dad, you're around all the time. And so because of that, there's a different idea of what masculinity looks like. And I think that they've been able to also sniff out what are some really toxic masculinities and resist those spaces. So we've seen them choose not to hang out with certain friends or choose certain sports or kind of spaces because of there's a kind of energy that they're not really familiar with. But at the same time, they still have to learn and live into it, and they're still navigating those things on their own. And we're excited to see what will happen. We're really proud of them, but no one can ever escape it.
It's good, babe.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Comments? Should we open that?
So we have another question. We're kind of going around, Becky, but don't mind us, Becky. So one is, are there times when mutual flourishing can be confused with fairness and kind of trying to make equal the opportunities? what might it look like in marriage where the wife may be much more passionate and dedicated to God's calling and really wants to serve and lead at the same time, she really wants her husband's flourishing, because otherwise she feels she can't flourish. And her flourishing seems to cause her husband to lose confidence, a vicious cycle. That's a really good question.
Do you want to answer that?
Well, I think in actuality, like this was kind of that example, and we've actually talked about this a lot, right? Where like I think so. I was in a job that so when we first moved to Seattle, I was in a job that I was really thankful for, and it was good people, but it wasn't necessarily like what I thought I wanted, like the epitome of what I wanted. And so within a couple of years, I'm kind of looking at every new job that kind of pops open. The reality of academic jobs is you can't just do them anywhere. They're almost always going to require a really significant move of the family. But at the same time, Gail had found a job where she was really flourishing. It was like one of the first ministry jobs that she'd found that really recognized her calling, that recognized her gifts, was giving her more opportunities as opposed to telling her what she couldn't do. And here I was like looking at for jobs, right? And I think that was actually a really hard time for us, because I really wanted to be happy for her. But I was also really not happy from myself. So I think that's actually one of those ideas where one of those moments where Gail had to really say, look, I'm really happy. The kids are really happy. And it wasn't exactly like, get on board, mister, but it kind of was. But the big thing that kind of, I think the one phrase that really got me, that helped me to begin to kind of shift my thinking a little bit was, look, I have followed you for 2 moves.
Yeah.
So Gail had followed me to grad school and then had come to Seattle. And each time basically had to build up a new life, like build up her career over, like from scratch. And that just really got me to realize, and again, this kind of comes back to the masculinity thing, is opportunities come easy for me. So why shouldn't I be able to go to the next thing? And if you've been with the kids and you've been kind of piecemealing things, so like surely you can just do that again, right? And so I think for me, this idea of sacrifice was to say, at the very least, I can try to build something up in the way that Gail's built something up in these other previous moments.
But I will also say, in that moment when I basically told him, I'm going to need you to figure it out, it's not without me really feeling bad for him, because he was not thriving at his job here, and it was 10 years. And so when the opportunity actually came for me to apply for this lead pastor position, we were already at 10 years here. He was not flourishing. And one of the things that I had to ask myself is, if I take this job, or if I apply, that means we're here for another significant season of time. Is he going to be okay? And I think that was a struggle. Is he going to be okay? And thankfully, there was a job that was opening right at the same time. And that's why some of you may be thinking, oh, Garrett, that's in Chicago. Wait, how does this work? So he actually turned it down. He got the job, turned it down, and said, my wife is in a call process and we won't know. So I'm going to need to turn it down. And over conversations, the school actually offered him a commuting kind of possibility. And so somehow this amazing combination of both of us being in positions where we're thriving, and his job being able to work out a possibility for him, even though it's in a different state. What a blessing.
Well, and I will say that the only reason why that job became an amazing possibility was because I also had to become open to the fact that my my wholeness and my confidence couldn't be rooted in my job, then my understanding of my flourishing was actually connected to Gail's flourishing. It was connected to our kids' flourishing. That if my job was the only thing that was going well in my life, I can't be happy with that. I can't have confidence in that. And so that was for us that was a really big, important kind of process of transformation for me to say, okay, if I'm gonna be here, I have to redefine what flourishing looks like. And again, but it's also one of those moments where it actually becomes really freeing, because then my job isn't the totality of who I am. So I started taking up biking and doing photography and writing, and kind of all of a sudden I was like, oh, wait a second, if I'm not on this, path, this particular path, then what are some other ways of finding a kind of whole life? And it's only then that this other job came, because this job was also, maybe in some forms of fashion, not the ideal job, on the career trajectory, but it ended up being the ideal job for the kind of full life that I was hoping for. That's because I waited.
That's good.
And so I think that's sometimes the gift of a life together, is that if we were really listening to one another and we're really hoping for the best for the other, then sometimes even in that waiting, in those hard spaces, we discover what's also best for us. And oftentimes the man is the one. I think there's a lot of freedom in waiting, and a lot of freedom in contingency and being bound to these other people, if we would kind of take the time to listen for it as well.
And I think I would just maybe want to, if there are no other questions, we're keeping our eyes on it, but maybe just close us by saying and reminding us that even though I wrote a chapter from a woman's perspective on gender called Glass Bulbs and Rubber Balls, I really think it can extend to anybody in any of these seasons of life, that there are moments where you have to assess what are the things that you can kind of let go of, that you don't have to have such a tight grip on, that will bounce back. And then there are, in every season, differing things in our lives that are fragile, that if it's dropped, it can have incredible consequences. So just navigating what those things are in any given season of your lives. Normally, we always say that it's usually when there's something new in our midst, or changes that are happening. Those are typically your glass bulbs that are fragile, that you have to care well for. It could be a new job. You might have moved to a new city, new relationship, new marriage, a transitioning of a loved one, whatever the case may be, a new baby. I think there's something to be said about creation in that, right? Creation is never about trying to juggle all the things and everybody's happy all at the same time, but it's cycles of rest, of flourish, of ebbing and flowing, of life and death. And so just that as a reminder to us that if we keep those things in mind, that mutual flourishing is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible.
I think we have time maybe for this one last question. So how would you describe your approach to conflict resolution as a couple? And how does the Bible inform the process? Well, we do. So I think conflict resolution, there's kind of multiple levels. So we kind of have to think about what is conflict. So there's two types of conflict. So one type of conflict is the perpetual ongoing conflict that comes from two different people living their life every single day, who have very different ways of approaching life, approaching problems, and managing who they are, and personalities. Yeah. So even like as we were preparing for today, I'm kind of like, let's just throw some stuff up on the
Yo, before
wall.
this webcast, we were like, are we going to do it my way or your way?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's, you know, and that's pretty much anytime we have to make a decision, there's a little bit of conflict because I'm just like, let's just see how it works out. And Gail's like, let's make a plan. And I'm like, yeah, let's plan to work it out. And
somebody help him.
Over and over and over again. And so part of the conflict is, I would say, and this can kind of get to like how the Bible informs us, is that there's one body and many parts. You know, that there's a certain moment when we begin to realize that there are certain things that Gail's good at, that there's certain things that I'm good at. There's certain moments when my way of doing something might work out okay, and there's some other moments when Gail's really necessary. But then there's also a kind of listening and hearing one another, realizing that, you know, that, oh wait, Gail's way is actually important because Gail sees things
always
down the road. Gail is preparing for things. She has a lot of things in her mind, whereas I don't really see anything until it's right up in my face. And so part of it's like in this process of listening. The other kind of conflict that happens though is, you know, I think when our expectations of one another is really kind of this kind of we don't meet one another's expectations in some form or fashion, or that there's a pattern that creates problems or is hurtful over time. And so here I think like this idea of kind of bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh is to say that, you know, if someone confronts me, if Gail confronts me and says, you know, like what you're doing is continually hurting me. I don't feel seen when you do these things, or I don't feel seen when you don't do these things, over and over and over again, regardless of what my personality is. I have to take that seriously because her pain is my pain. And so so when we think about conflict resolution, so some of the conflict resolution is that one of us needs to be really introspective, maybe both of us in certain moments, and ask ourselves, why do we continue to do these things? What is it in our own history, in our own family systems, and our kind of racial and ethnic kind of realities that kind of trigger a certain kind of response in a moment. So there's a kind of self introspection, but then there's also a kind of listening. You know, what if this person's right?
And I would say, as far as our particular approach to conflict resolution, for the most part, is we always take some time. And this has kind of been our regular rhythm, is whenever one person is, you know, mad or upset with the other person, and or we sense that there's conflict, I know for me, I need time to process so I don't say things that I'm going to regret. I've gotten a lot better at it, but we call our conflict resolution intense fellowship, and then I go into silent fellowship. To just kind of gather myself, think about what I'm going to say. Because I'm extroverted, I can just blurt things out. So I practice kind of internal conversations within myself. And then we kind of come to the table when we're ready to hear and to speak. And I will also say this, I know there are people who say, don't ever go to bed angry. And for us personally, we've gone to bed angry many times. And I think it's been good for us. Because then in the morning, sometimes when we sleep on something, in the morning, we might wake up and be like, what was that? That was so ridiculous, right? Because we may be really tired at the end of the night and we get into a little tiff. But what we don't do, we will go to bed angry at times. But what we don't do is sleep apart. We always choose to sleep together in the same bed, like we always do. Nobody leaves, nobody sleeps on the couch, and we work it out. So I think just being in conflict is real, it's human. But at the end of the day, it's, again, we come back to like, we gotta trust. We got to trust that the other person has our best interest in mind. And that's what we hope for at the end of the day.
Thanks so much. That was a great question.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm mindful of the time. So one thing, if you wanted to kind of follow us online, my handle on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter is Gail Song Bantum, and yours is a little different on each one.
So on Facebook and Twitter, I'm Brian Bantum. On Instagram, I'm Prof BKB.
Prof, short for professor, BKB. And then you can also find us on our website, thebantumspace.com, and you can contact us through that website as well and find all the things we're up to in life, in ministry, all the good stuff you can find at thebantumspace.com. All right. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to join us for this. We want to encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to grab a book, share it with people. We know that this book is much more, it's less trendy in the moment, but more long-term. And our prayer is that if it even helps one relationship, we thank God. And the work was worth it, and the writing was worth it. And so we trust that our story will have a multiplying effect of God's more than enoughness, that God is able to redeem our stories, our histories, our past. God is able to redeem our understandings of love and flourishing. And that's our prayer for you as well, and for your loved ones. So we thank you for sharing this space with us. Any thoughts? Any last thoughts or words?
We just want to thank you for being here. And as always, right?
Keep it mutual. All right, fam.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.